it was, in fact, yesterday that we showed the bat to the entire pavilion, 50 sessions over. Today, it is the second half of that approaching the century. That is what I'm made to believe, in the sense like we are aiming for a century. Today, on the 51st session, we have a wonderful speaker, and as is ordinary with our platform, no formalities, nothing. The topic being interpretation of statutes, nomenclature in a particular manner, which will be explained by the speaker himself. Over to Justice Bachu Thomas.
Thank you, Shyam. As you might have, good afternoon, Justice Ramkumar sir. Good afternoon, Justice Kamal Pasha sir, and all my friends. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you on this 13th. Shyam said it's going to be Friday the 13th. I corrected him by saying it's Saturday the 13th. For some, 13th is a lucky number. 13 is a lucky number. I hope 13 is a lucky number too for me. Anyway, as you might have noticed or wondered what this topic is all about, unraveling the conundrum of legislative intent. I'll come to that a bit later. But what I intended to convey by this topic is create some confusion. Rather than conveying something very clearly, right out of the box, I thought the whole manner in which statutes are worded, especially of late, creates a lot of confusion in our minds. So rather than just saying interpretation of statutes, I thought a confusing topic would actually gather more purpose behind our attempt in gathering the intent of every legislation. That is why I named it as unraveling the conundrum of legislative intent. In fact, the word conundrum is, I shall at a later point of time refer to one of the recent judgments of the Supreme Court. Justice Deepak Gupta refers to this word, saying, how shall we decipher the conundrum of legislative intent? So that is where I thought it may have some relevance in using that term. But whatever said and done, it is only interpretation of statute, nothing. Now, why I wanted to speak about interpretation of statutes when Shyam asked me to speak is I've always felt that perhaps the most important tool of a lawyer or a judge is interpretation of statutes. Probably constitutional law, administrative law, interpretation of statutes. These three would be three of the most important aspects of a lawyer, but of which I feel interpretation must have a primary importance. Reason being, every lawyer from every hierarchy of courts, in every hierarchy of courts, will have use with the interpretation of statutes. Constitutional law may have relevance in the constitutional courts of High Court or Supreme Court. Administrative law also, to a large extent, only in the High Court and the Supreme Court. But interpretation of statutes, wherever law is applied, it has a relevance. Unfortunately, most of us, after our college days, we tend to brush aside the concept of interpretation. We seldom use it. We always refer to facts and assume that the facts will lead to the law. True. Facts certainly lead to a law, but then every provision or every position of law can be canvassed by twisting the words in a statute. This is where the lawyers can play on the mind of the judge, and also the judge can assimilate the words intended by the legislature. Different tools are there. It is an ocean. Interpretation of statutes is actually an ocean, which may need probably a year to speak about. It may take a year to completely decipher it. So what I've done, what I'm planning to do is, I'll just refer to the fundamental aspect of, or maybe just refresh our idea about the fundamental aspects of interpretation. Then go into two salutary principles of interpretation, which we may, most of us would find it repetition. but it may have some benefit at some point of our career, and also refer to two aspects which are generally not referred to by lawyers or judges, but occasionally arises. Very seldom it arises, but when it arises, it may have some significance. So these are the three methods in which I plan to devote my time. And I would like to stop at exactly 45 minutes. At the end of 45 minutes, if Shyam could tell me wherever I am, I will stop.
The bell will ring.
Okay. So I'll just go ahead with this. Salmon puts it in, we have all learned in Salmon on jurisprudence in our college days, that essence of law lies in the spirit and not in its letter. But letter is regarded as a manifestation, an external manifestation of the intention that underlies it. When looked upon in that manner, every statutory provision is an expression of the intention of the person making it, expressed in terms of words. Unfortunately, since the words of every language, other than computer language, are not scientific symbols, having any precise or definite meaning, that is where the whole difficulty arises. Even in our day-to-day life, we take, for example, communication between husband and wife, friends, colleagues, father and son. Effective communication seldom takes place between the giver of the information and the recipient. This is not due to any problem in comprehension or the problem of language. It is mainly on account of the problem of meaning of the words and their ineffectiveness as a means or as a medium of expression to communicate a particular thought. I'll just repeat that. It is a problem of words being an ineffective medium of expression to communicate a particular thought. The precise thought we have in our mind, we may not be able to illustrate in terms of words. There are certain ideal examples of that. Maybe gestures would be able to communicate in a better manner than words. I've got an example of how to do it, but right now, since time is short, I'm not doing it. One classic thing is you ask the audience to raise your finger and say, touch your chin, and you touch your cheek. People would be touching the cheek instead of the chin. They go by your gestures rather than by the words. Now, these are all tools of communication. So, when the legislature has put into words their thoughts, there are bound to be differences in comprehension, differences in meaning. This is where lawyers can regard this as a gold mine. Had there been perfect legislation, there may not have been any need for lawyers or for judges or for any courts. If every law is very clear, why should the lawyers be there? The parties themselves can appear if at all their case comes up. So this is a gold mine for lawyers. The very fact that legislature has never been able to effectively create a legislation or effectively convey their mind, put it into words. Now, application of law depends on facts, but interpretation of law is generally independent of facts. Salmon defines interpretation as a process by which the courts seek to ascertain the meaning of the legislation through the authoritative form in which it is expressed. In the process of understanding the mind of the legislature, as we are all aware, there are two main rules of interpretation. I'm sure all of you would be aware about the two main rules of interpretation. One, now this is the first part I'm dealing with. Of the three parts, this is the first part. This is just a refreshing of our old learning. First is a literal interpretation or the literal rule, and the second is a mischief rule. Of course, I'll come to the mischief rule, which is no longer regarded as a mischief rule. Though it originated in England, the United Kingdom Parliament itself has request for a change of the terminology mischief rule into purposive construction. Now, I'll just go through the literal interpretation part first. The literal interpretation part, or otherwise called the golden rule, is the most cardinal rule of construction of a statute. It means that the statute is to be read in the natural, ordinary, or in its popular sense. Give the language of a statute the normal meaning. No omission of words, no addition of words. Every sentence should be construed in the grammatical meaning, because the legislature is expected to convey as clearly as possible what it wanted. So whatever words have been used by the legislature, it has been put in the legislation in the plain, normal, grammatical meaning. Now, one aspect here is the ordinary meaning should not be construed, dehosed, or separated from the context in which it appears. Because every word, we take every word in any language, every word has a particular meaning in that particular context. There is no absolute meaning to a word. No word can be defined in a vacuum. So the context has certain advantages. One of the examples which I had read is about the word waist or skin. The moment we hear about the word waist or skin, what comes to our mind is the waist of a person, the skin of a human being, or the skin of an animal. Now imagine this terminology being used in an admiralty statute, or a merchant shipping, or a statute relating to a ship. These words, if we say that, if we interpret the word waist or skin in relation to a statute relating to a ship as meaning the waist of a person or the skin of a person, it makes no sense. Because waist of a ship and skin of a ship are peculiar words special to that particular vessel. So each word may have to be given the ordinary meaning, but in reference to the context in which they occur. There is also another aspect to the literal meaning where the words are used in a legal sense. I'm not harping much upon it, but rather just referring to one of the earliest decisions on a classic case called the Gannon-Tangally. Most of you would be aware, Gannon-Tangally was a state of Madras, the decision of which led to the amendment being brought into Article 366(29)(a) to the Constitution of India, defining the word sale of goods, taxes on sale of goods. In Gannon-Tangally's case, the Supreme Court, Madras High Court, as well as the Supreme Court held that the word sale of goods occurring in the Madras Sales Tax Act, which provided a charging section for tax on sale of goods. It said, the word sale of goods occurring in the taxing statute is included in a legal sense, in the sense meaning that there must be an agreement for sale and also a transfer of property pursuant to that agreement for sale. So in the absence of any one of these conditions, there would not be any sale of goods. This decision actually led to the amendment of creating a deemed sale for certain aspects like service of food in a hotel and hire purchase contract, then construction contracts. So the Supreme Court said that words in that statute, taxes on taxing statute, was used in the legal sense and not in an ordinary sense of sale of goods. When can we depart from the literal rule? The general principle is that the literal rule should not be departed from. The departure must be done only in exceptional cases. Because the moment we we depart from the literal rule, the courts or the lawyers will be launching into a sea of difficulties, which will be very difficult to fathom. Then it will be like an unruly horse. Each judge will go on a particular way in the manner he wishes. The guidelines, the precedents, the precepts will all go awry if we start departing from the literal rule. The departure is permitted or carried out or done only when the normal interpretation or the ordinary interpretation or the golden rule of interpretation, if carried out, would lead to some absurdity, or there is something in the context or object of the statute which gives an indication that the legislature used the word in a different sense. That is the only time when the ordinary meaning should be departed from. Of course, time and again, courts have held that there must be a judicial restraint in departing from the rule of literal construction. As much as possible, if circumstances warrant it, literal construction should be the method to be adopted. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, one of the recent judgments that was decided on 9/1/2020 by Justice Deepak Gupta, who just retired, I found it to be quite an interesting one, because of late, there's been a tendency of the judges, on the part of the judges, pardon me for saying so, there's been a tendency to give the words in a statute the meaning which the court feels, which may fit into the scheme of things. There are several instances where they have done that. The judge may say that in the fitness of things, he feels that this is the intention which the legislature thought must have been there for this, must have intended to be for that statute. This may be on the basis of an inartistic or a clumsy legislation or a clumsy wording that has been used. Now, in this decision, I'll just refer to that decision. I'll just read that. This is called Shilpa Mittal versus State of NCT and Delhi, 2020, 2 SEC 87. 787, 2020, 2 SEC 787. When the intention of the legislature is clear, but the wording of the statute is inartistic or clumsy, then the court can add or subtract words to a statute. I repeat that. When the intention of the legislature is clear, but the wording of the statute is clumsy or inartistic, court can add words to the statute or subtract the words. If the intention of the legislature is unclear, court cannot add or subtract words in the statute to give it a meaning which the court feels would fit into the scheme of things. The intention of the legislature is not what the judge feels it should be. Now, I may add to that, the personal philosophy of the judge should not be brought in as a purported intention of the legislature. This is in effect what the court has said. So if the intention of the legislature is clear, then the court cannot add words. But if the intention is not clear, but the words of a statute are clear, then go by what the words of statute says. Now we come to the second part of the interpretation, that is the mischief rule, or the rule in the Hayden's case, as everyone would be aware, or now it is called as the purposive construction. I'll just refer to it swiftly. The mischief rule arises when the words in the statute are capable of different meanings. It should be applied only when a departure from the literal rule of construction could be adopted. This was laid down in the Hayden's case in the 15th century and has now attained the status of a classic. The principle, as I mentioned earlier, is now known as the purposive approach or purposive construction. 4 things are to be considered when we adopt this principle. 1, what was the law before the making of the statute? Now, after identifying that, we check what was the defect or mischief which the law did not provide in that earlier statute. What is the remedy under the new statute or provision? Then what is the purpose of that? What is the reason for that remedy? After, as per this construction, after getting the answers to the above questions, then the court starts adopting that construction which suppresses that mischief and advances a remedy. In other words, after we identify the purpose for the new legislation, the courts must attempt to give effect to the purpose of the legislation. And in that process, we may even look at extraneous material which may have a bearing on why the legislation was enacted. Now, I complete that first part where we just refresh the basic principles of interpretation and move on to the second part. In the second part, I would like to deal with two principles of interpretation, which are quite often referred to by lawyers and quite often we mistakenly use also. The first principle is called the principle of, normally everyone refers to it as ejusdem generis. In Latin, the letter J is not there. So it is actually pronounced as ejusdem generis. But everyone refers to it as ejusdem generis. Either way, it is fine. In Latin, if you remember, Salmon on jurisprudence refers to jurisprudence and jurisprudence, because in Latin, J is not there. So it is ejusdem generis. G is pronounced as in guy and not as in gent. Justice Jayashankar Nambiar had told me several years ago, several decades ago about this. Now, the principle of ejusdem generis, when there are general words followed by particular or specific words, the general words must be confined to the specific things of the same kind as specified. This is often mistaken for the principle of nocere res sociis. These principles are both generally intermingled by the lawyers or by the judges. There is a subtle distinction between them. I'll come to the nocere res sociis part later. Nocere res sociis is the genus of which ejusdem generis is a species. I'll repeat, under ejusdem generis, a particular word or a specific words are followed by a general word. The general word will take color from the specific words, provided the specific words or the particular words form the same genus. Now, in fact, Kerala High Court had an occasion to consider this in respect of one of the most recent statutes in the country, the Kerala Disaster and Public Health Emergency Special Ordinances 2020, which was brought in on 30th of April 2020 in relation to the COVID, where the government wanted to defer the salary of government employees. One of the arguments raised was that the word otherwise is used. Disaster, public health, or otherwise. These are the occasions when the government could defer the salary. Now, the word otherwise, according to the council, gave unbridled powers upon the government to defer salary at any time they wanted. So on that ground, it said that it becomes arbitrary and unconstitutional. Now, the court prima facie found, as an interim measure, found that the word otherwise is controlled by the word public health and disaster, and found that these form part of a same genus as per the definition. And looking at the preamble of the statute, it interprets the word otherwise as being curtailed by those two words, and only on those two occasions can the government defer the salary and found prima facie to be constitutionally valid. Now, the application of the principle of ejusdem generis can be done only when the specific words or the particular words preceding the general word form a same category or same species or the same class. For example, I'll say, suppose we have lizards, insects, cockroaches, and other animals. If a question arises as to what would be the meaning to be ascribed to the word animals, would it include any other animal like a cow or a dog? You can say the other words that precede the word animals form a same class or a same kind, even if it is different. So that same kind or same class will control that general word. This is what the principle of ejusdem generis means. Now, when it comes to nocere res sociis, it is wider. It is a principle which is much wider than the principle of ejusdem generis. As I mentioned earlier, ejusdem generis is a species of nocere, of which nocere res sociis is a genus of which ejusdem generis is a species. Now, one of the classic expositions of this said rule is given in Maxwell on statutory interpretation. It says that when two or more words which are susceptible of analogous meaning are coupled together. I'll just read that once again. When two or more words which are susceptible of analogous meaning are coupled together, they are understood to be used in the cognate sense. They take color from each other. The more general is restricted in a sense analogous to the less general. Now, each word, like for example, in Article 233 relating of the Constitution, relating to posting, the word used is posting, promotion, and appointment of a district judge. Question arose as to whether the word posting means normal transfer of a district judge. Supreme Court held, referring to the principle of nocere res sociis, that the word posting is controlled by appointment, and hence it is not every transfer of a district judge that will come under Article 233. It is the posting pursuant to the initial appointment under Article 233. A similar instance is one which can actually illustrate is, I got it from G.P. Singh on statutory interpretation, relating to the Rajasthan rules of business, where compulsory retirement was occurring in the Rajasthan rules of business along with dismissal and removal. Now, the question was whether every type of compulsory retirement would come within that purview of this. Supreme Court said that every kind of compulsory retirement is not brought in within the purview of this, but only those compulsory retirement necessitated on account of something akin to dismissal or removal, like a punishment. If a compulsory retirement is necessitated as a means of punishment upon an employee, then only that principle will apply. They said by applying the principle of nocere res sociis, the word will be governed, the word compulsory retirement in that context, in the Rajasthan rules of business, will be controlled by the word dismissal and removal. Now I come to the third part. The third part, I would like to refer to two things which are quite confusing and which I would say some judgments have misinterpreted the concepts also. Those are, in general terms, we can call it legislation by reference. This is a statute, this is a legislative tool used by the legislature to avoid a verbatim reproduction of one provision of an earlier act, but wanted to use those provisions into a subsequent act. There is another method which is called legislation by reference, and another called legislation by incorporation. So these two methods, legislation by reference and legislation by incorporation. Now, it's slightly confusing as to what would be the exact difference between these two concepts. It is a matter of construction. I could find that even at times when we feel that it is a legislation by reference, courts have interpreted it as a legislation by incorporation. One of the classic cases in this is the Mahindra, is a case called Mahindra and Mahindra. That was in 1975. I shall read from that. 1979 2 SEC 529. Now, the question that arose, actually, if I mentioned that this whole concept could be easily illustrated. The question was, under the Monopolies, Restrictive and Trade Practices Act, MRTP Act, then in force, now it is repealed, Section 55 of the MRTP Act provided for an appeal to the High Court. The section said, an appeal shall lie on the a person aggrieved may prefer an appeal to the High Court on one or more of the grounds specified in Section 100 of the CPC. Now, this was a pre-1977 statute, MRTP Act. Pre-1977, Section 100 had 3 grounds on which one could prefer a second appeal to the High Court. One is that the decision appealed against was contrary to law. Another was that there was a question of law which could attract the jurisdiction of the High Court. Now, one must remember, pre-1977, if the judgment is, if the decision appealed against is contrary to law, or if there is a question of law involved. Now, in 1977, Section 100 was amended. Rather than having 3 grounds of appeal, they brought in this concept of 1 ground of appeal. That is, there must be a substantial question of law, as in contradistinction to question of law. So, the question arose in the case 79 Supreme Court. Should there be a substantial question of law to prefer an appeal under MRTP Act post 1977? Section 55 refers to on one or more of the grounds specified in Section 100 as a ground of appeal. After referring to the whole concept of legislation by reference or legislation by incorporation, the reason why this legislation by reference or incorporation has an importance or had an importance was because if it is a legislation by reference, every amendment that takes place, even post such reference or post the subsequent enactment, will also be deemed to be part of the subsequent enactment. But if it is a legislation by incorporation, only those amendments that took place as on the date of incorporation or date of coming into force of the subsequent act alone will have application. So if the MRTP Act, Section 55 of the MRTP Act is a legislation by incorporation, then Section 100 CPC, as it was there prior to 1977, alone will be there. If it is a legislation by reference, the amendment that took place to Section 100 CPC will also be part of Section 55. Now, after referring to various authorities, Lord Escher, Master of Rolls, is the one who coined this concept of legislation by incorporation and legislation by reference in a case called, in a referred matter called Woods Estate. After referring to all that, Justice Bhagwati, I'll read that few sentences because I found it to be of great help, especially to clear some of the doubts. In fact, there is a decision prior to this Mahindra's case called Narasimha, MV Narasimha's case, which refers to this legislation. But this actually more clearly elucidates this principle. I'll just read that for the benefit. Now, we must also bear in mind Section 8.1 of the General Clauses Act. Section 8.1 says that when there is a repeal or a reenactment with or without any modification, any provision of a former enactment, then references in any other enactment or in any instrument to the provision so repealed shall, unless a different intention appears to be construed as reference to the provision so reenacted. Now, 8.1, according to me, will apply, and even according to the Supreme Court, will apply only with respect to legislation by reference. I'll just read this one paragraph. Where there is a mere reference to or citation of one enactment in another without actual incorporation, Section 8.1 applies, and the repeal and reenactment of the provision referred to or cited has the effect set out in that section, and the reference to the provision repealed is required to be construed as reference to the provision as reenacted. Where a provision of one statute is incorporated in another, the repeal or amendment of the former, I'll repeat that, where a provision of one statute is incorporated in another, the repeal or amendment of the former does not affect the latter. The effect of incorporation is as if the provision incorporated were written out in the incorporating statute and were a part of it. Legislation by incorporation is a common legislative device employed by the legislature, where the legislature, for convenience of drafting, incorporates provisions from an existing statute by reference to that statute instead of setting out for itself at length the provisions which it desires to adopt. Once the incorporation is made, the provision incorporated becomes an integral part of the statute in which it is transposed. And thereafter, there is no need to refer to the statute from which the incorporation is made, and any subsequent amendment made in it has no effect on the incorporation statute. Now, Ramkumar sir would be able to remember, at least recollect, the provision of Section 21 of the Indian Penal Code that defines public servant, which underwent an amendment. But there was no corresponding amendment in the PC Act.
47 Act.
Yes, 1947. So in one of the cases that arose, the contention was raised that I'm not a that person who was an employee of a government company, a government-owned company, said that under the PC Act, proceedings cannot be initiated against me because I am not a public servant under the PC Act. Though under the Indian Penal Code, the word defined underwent an amendment and brought in the government company also, an employee of a government company also as a public servant. The argument was that under the PC Act, what was done in the definition clause of public servant was only a legislation by incorporation and not a legislation by reference. Now, this is where I would say that now the difference is actually whittled down quite a lot, probably because the circumstances warranted it. To avoid that person from going scot-free, Supreme Court said that even if it is a legislation by incorporation, if 4 conditions are satisfied, the subsequent amendments can also be brought in, can also be attracted and become or be regarded as part and parcel of the new act. The 4 conditions which they said was that if the later act and the earlier act are supplemental to each other, first condition. Or second, if the 2 acts are in pari materia with each other. Or 3, where the amendment carried out to the earlier act, if not imported into the later act would be rendered meaningless or unworkable. Then, and 4, where the amendment of the earlier act, either expressly or by necessary intendment, applies to the later act, then even if it is a legislation by incorporation, these subsequent amendments can be regarded as part and parcel of the subsequent act. Applying these principles, in that case, Supreme Court found that the acts will become unworthy. The Prevention of Corruption Act will become unworkable, and that by expressly or by necessary intendment, the amendment to the word public servant in Indian Penal Code will apply in all its vigor to the PC Act and convicted that person. Now, this is why I said the difference is actually whittled down or narrowed down, but depending upon the case that arises, the manner of construction that is adopted, there are means and ways for the court to now adopt the whichever one is suitable to the particular statute. This is where the recent judgment of Justice Deepak Gupta has some relevance. It is not the philosophy of the judge that matters, but it is the intention of the legislature that has to be borne in mind. Now, with this, I have completed my 3 parts. If time permits, I can go into 2 aspects, or Shyam, how much time did I take?
If anything permits, it's only time. Go ahead, sir.
How much time left for 45 minutes?
I think my watch has stopped, so don't worry. Please, go ahead.
I think I've reached 40 minutes.
I mean, let us not keep the constraint of time. Let's have it. Yeah.
Okay. I'll refer to 2 things. One is regarding illustration. The 3 things that could be referred to. One is the preamble or the headings, the illustrations, the provisos. So I'll refer to illustration and probably stop with that. Now, we have noticed that the pre-constitution laws, if you have seen through the pre-constitution laws, we could find those laws have used illustrations in plenty, while the post-constitution laws have seldom used it. The Indian Evidence Act, the Penal Code, the Indian Contract Act are all some statutes where we find the illustrations. As you are all aware that illustrations cannot modify the language of a section, nor can it expand or curtail the scope of the section. The illustrations certainly form a part of a statute, but it does not form part of a section. Though it has some relevance while construing the section, it cannot actually control the section at all. Courts can take aid of the illustrations. At times, courts have ignored the illustrations or brushed aside the illustrations. At times, courts have given great value. But one thing I felt of interest is Section 133 of the Evidence Act and Section 114B of the Evidence Act. The principle is that it is the principle that the Supreme Court have stated is it is always unsafe to convict an accused on the basis of an uncorroborated testimony of an accomplice. I'll read that section. This is the principle. The Supreme Court has laid down this principle that it is unsafe to convict an accused on the basis of an uncorroborated testimony of an accomplice. Now, I'll read section 133 of the Evidence Act. An accomplice shall be a competent witness against an accused person, and a conviction is not illegal merely because it proceeds upon the uncorroborated testimony of an accomplice. So the principle laid down by the Supreme Court that uncorroborated testimony of an accomplice is not a safe method to sure evidence, certain evidence to convict an accused goes against section 133. Now, I would like to read section 114B.
Illustration B.
114, illustration B. I'm sorry, illustration B. The court may presume B, that an accomplice is unworthy of credit unless he is corroborated in material particulars. Is it that the section 133 is made redundant by the Supreme Court by recourse to the illustration B to section 114? Actually, section 133 has been reduced to a dead letter by this principle taken from, or the cue taken from section 114 illustration B. So there are times when illustrations have been of importance, even reference to Contract Act also. I think I will stop at that. In the discussions, the provisos, the definitions, all those could be referred to, as otherwise there will not be any end to the principles of statutory interpretation. It can go on and on and on. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. We have Justice Nagamuthu also joining us, sir. Can you just unmute yourself?
Yes. Sir, good evening to all of you.
Good evening. Good evening.
Yes.
Good evening.
It's a really wonderful lecture, sir. I enjoyed it a lot. And the page end, Honorable Justice Thomas told us that reconciliation between illustration B, section 114, and section 133. In my view, there is no collision between these two provisions, between 114, the main section, and section 133. Of course, leave alone this illustration. What I would say is that under section 114, it speaks only of may presume. May presume. Suppose the court, this may presume means it is a natural presumption which can be deducible from the A fact which is proved, which stands proved. I put it very simply. Suppose A fact is proved. If the prudence of a man will deduce the proof of B fact from out of A fact, then this falls under section 114, may presume. It's a natural presumption otherwise. It is not a presumption imposed by law, like a shall presume, or it is not a declaration made under section 4 of the Evidence Act that it will be conclusive. That is a declaration made. And as I said, I want to repeat, it is not a direction by the court to presume. It is a natural presumption. Therefore, when the court refuses to presume that he is unworthy of credit, there is nothing illegal. It is not unlawful to convict him on the uncorroborated testimony of an accomplice. So 133 is an independent provision that is not controlled by 114. That is what I feel. That's what I feel, and I leave it. I throw it open for the views of other participants.
You are not visible in the sense like.
And one thing is very clear: your lecture was so thorough, so clear, so deep, and I really enjoyed it. That's all I can say. And this issue, I just throw it open for all of you to make your comment. That is all. Thank you very much, sir. Sir, God bless you. God bless you.
Thank
And
you, sir.
I am sure that he will be one of the pillars of the institution. We are out of the institution now after retirement, but still we have not lost our interest in the institution. So the very fact that we are all sitting for every day for 2 hours will show that show our interest in the institution. God bless you, sir. God bless you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think you remember me. We had an occasion to meet in Supreme Court corridors once.
I remember you very much. In fact, I was about to, Justice Basant introduced me to you.
Yes. One more thing, and yes, sir. Yes. So it's a public domain, so therefore I do not want to speak more on that. Let us go to the subject. Let us not be personal. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. God bless you.
Thank you, sir.
Ramkumar, sir.
Beautiful analysis of the crux of the principles of interpretation. In fact, that legislation by reference and legislation by incorporation. In incorporation, a provision of an earlier law is bodily lifted and imported into the statute, subsequent statute. Therefore, whatever happens to the earlier section or earlier law is not at all applicable to the incorporated.
Before you could complete your this in discussion, I want to make one more thing also.
Yes, Mr. Nagut.
So very recently, or 2 weeks before, I think that Honorable Justice K.M. Joseph in Somasundaram was a state had delivered a judgment. Somasundaram was the state of Tamil Nadu. It is a very sensational case in the state of Tamil Nadu. In that case, Honorable Justice K.M. Joseph, one of the members of the 3-judge bench, has held that explanation 4 to section 108 is virtually an exception to section 108. Yes, in Somasundaram was a state. A recent judgment, 2 weeks before judgment was delivered. Explanation 4 to section 108 of IPC. It should be construed as an exception to section 108.
Exception to section?
Explanation 4 to section 108 of IPC. Abetment. Abet or 108 abet. Exception 4 should be construed as an exception. That is the interpretation given. Recent judgment, if time permits, please kindly read the judgment.
Exception to
108 itself.
The explanation 4 reads that the abatement of an offense being an offense, the abatement of such an abatement is also an offense.
Yes, that is the explanation.
That is the explanation for
this Honorable Justice K.T. Thomas in one of the cases has said that the concept of abatement is inconceivable. That is observation, but it was not a law declared. It was only a passing observation made in one of the judgments of Honorable Justice K.T. Thomas. But here, in this case, Honorable Justice Joseph has said that this illustration acts as an exception to section 108. Kindly see the time permit, please kindly read the judgment. Somasundaram was a state.
Somasundaram was a state.
Yes, state of Tamil Nadu. Please kindly see.
Yeah, I got
Yes,
it.
the shape, yes, the tools of interpretation are often changing. Tools of interpretation, yes, are used according to the needs of the society.
It's a 205-page judgment.
Yes, that
My
is good.
goodness.
Oh.
What is the citation, please?
It is not yet reported.
Oh,
I think we got it from the Supreme Court site.
Sir, I will also look at the judgment. I will read the relevant portion. And after some time, let me not detain all of you from discussing the matter further. Please, go ahead with the discussion. I will look at that.
Thank you, sir.
Please.
Ramkumar, sir.
yes, I was only mentioning about my understanding of this principle, namely the legislation by incorporation and legislation by reference. As rightly said by Mr. Bechu Kurian Thomas.
Yes.
Legislation by reference, you are only referring to an earlier statute. Whatever happened to the earlier statute will be applicable to the statute into which where it has been referred. Whereas if it is incorporation, it is bodily lifted from the earlier statute and imported into the subsequent statute. Therefore, whatever happens to the incorporated portion, to the earlier statute from which it has been bodily lifted, will have no effect on the incorporated statute. That's all.
Sir, so that is a principle, but in that decision
that has been being obliterated.
Yeah.
Being obliterated.
So what they've done, what the statute said is that an appeal shall lie on one or more of the grounds specified in section 100. On first reading, I thought it is just a legislation by reference. All what is mentioned there is one or more grounds specified in section 100. Court held that this is a legislation by incorporation.
Right.
So it is actually a reference. It is only referring to it.
And new section does not contain 3 grounds.
It contains only one ground.
One ground.
So they said this is a legislation by incorporation and not reference. So the subsequent amendment will not apply. Your right of appeal or the manner of appeal will be on the basis of the 3 grounds mentioned earlier.
Otherwise, there are no 3 grounds.
Only one ground is available.
Kamal Bhatt.
Okay. Justice Bechu, it was excellent and a very good work and a beautiful illustration. Your illustrations were given by you on all the points. Then regarding this 114 illustration B to 114 and 133, what the Supreme Court said is that what the Supreme Court says is that even though 133 is a rule of law by itself, illustration B to 114 would govern the field on the ground or because it is a rule of prudence. That's what the Supreme Court says. It is the rule of prudence. And the judges will go by rule of prudence instead of the bare rule of law. That's what Supreme Court has said on that point.
No, but what I thought was that rule of prudence, certainly it is a matter of great prudence, but then that is going against directly confronting the statutory provision.
Because these are contradictory, no doubt. We give interpretations by saying that this is only the rule of mere rule of evidence, the other one is rule of prudence, etc. But it is a fact that these are contradictory, provisions are contradictory by meaning. No doubt. But 114, see, is only an illustration, whereas 133 is a main provision. Illustration, in fact, cannot override a provision of law. That's but court has, as rightly pointed out by you, the court has asked a bit by saying that 14B is a rule of prudence and it has to be followed. Okay. Then regarding incorporation, and also by reference, I feel there was an occasion wherein there was an amendment in 138. 138 the negotiable instruments. So there was another legislation also, wherein there was that legislation that I am not now remembering the statute, but see, there was a reference by there was it was a mere reference. It was a reference and not mere incorporation. And in that case, I'm not exactly remembering the citation. And it was, in fact, held that, the subsequent amendment will have effect over the other one.
So that is because it might have been, it is interpreted as a legislation by reference.
A reference. Right. Then regarding the, section 100 CPC, when section 100 CPC as such has been mentioned, even though it has not been incorporated as a whole, when we see all the parameters of section 100 has to be followed, then I feel that what the Supreme Court has said is correct, because it is it is one of incorporation and not the other.
Because it is actually a tool to to shorten the words of the statute, rather than extracting the entire section 100 CPC and putting it into section 55 of the MRTP Act. They just mention this. So that is also a means of incorporation. That is how they went about it.
Effect is on of incorporation. I feel.
Otherwise, the Section 55 of the MRTP Act could be unworkable, is it not? Wording of Section 55.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly. Okay. Anyway,
Before
good work has been done, and we are enriched, Justice Bachu.
before we open up
Mr. Shyam, may I say?
for,
Sir, I got the benefit of the judgment before me now.
put on your video also so that we can have your present face also on screen.
Not like this. See, I have the benefit of the judgment. So I'm sorry
Okay.
that the judgment speaks of explanation 3, not 4. Paragraph 41. So paragraph 41. This is what is stated. Thus, the explanation 3 constitutes an exception to the main provisions of Section 108 of the IPC. Paragraph 41. Thus, the explanation 3,
Which reads that it is not necessary that the person abetted should be capable by law of committing an offense,
yes,
or that he should have the same guilty intention or knowledge as that of the abettor, or any guilty intention or knowledge.
yes. It only explains. It cannot act as an exception. So, but in paragraph 41, this is the observation. Thus, the explanation 3 constitutes an exception to the main provisions of Section 108 of the IPC. So, therefore, tools of interpretation are going on changing, and we are using it according to the needs of the society. That's what.
That's true. Actually,
but with the great respect, with the due respect, I find it very difficult to accept this concept.
Anyway, Mr. Bachu need not harp upon much.
Yes.
Thanks to Vivek and Imran, criminal appeal number 403 of 2010 decided on 3/6/2020. That is also has been posted. The entire text has been posted in the chat so that all of you who would like to have the benefit of the judgment can go through that.
But it should be capable by law of committing offense.
Correct, sir. In the meanwhile, Bachu sir, something that has come up, a question which is very simple, but I thought it has got some other dimension as well. If somebody want to say what I said, what I meant, why not ask the person who said or meant that? Instead of going for a third party or a third person to interpret that. Very logical, and the question is very simple. Why can't we have a reference to the legislature itself? When we have a reference to the Supreme Court or the higher authority for clarification, why can't you have a reference to what exactly did you mean?
We have quite often come across instances where the speeches of ministers in the legislature gives an indication of the statute. Courts have held that that is not a tool for interpretation. It may give some indication, but on that basis, one cannot interpret the statute. Perhaps Justice Ramkumar sir, who was a legislative secretary, was a law secretary.
Yes. See, we on the judicial side.
What happens is generally, I'm sure that the legislature would not even be aware what are the terms of a statute. I do not know. Subject to correction.
Exactly. A legal shape is very often given by the law department, not by the legislative department. And very often we on the judicial side say that the legislature in its wisdom. And I have seen the wisdom of the legislature.
Sir, similarly,
that they have wisdom. Okay.
So similarly, I wish to bring to your notice one more thing also. So you please kindly refer to Section 141 of IPC. 141. So third.
Yes. Okay.
So this is when an assembly becomes unlawful. What is the object which makes the assembly as unlawful object? Third, to commit any mischief or criminal trespass or other offense. The other offense is to be interpreted by applying the principle of adjustum generis.
Mischief, okay. It must be must be
Some-
something akin to mischief or criminal trespass.
Something
Not
related to
every-
that. The common thread is these two offenses relate to property. So something relating to property.
Property.
But
That is
yes.
a thread that runs through these
Yes.
two offenses.
Yes, in 2014, the Honorable Supreme Court has said that any offense means any offense under the IPC. Which means if that is the case, then the classification is unnecessary.
Yes.
The classification is unnecessary. You can very well say common object means any object which will be an offense. Any offense under the IPC, that would have been sufficient. So but this is contrary to the view taken in 1913 by the Sri Lankan High Court. In Sri Lanka, they apply the doctrine of adjustum generis and they say that this term other offense would not include every offense under IPC. But our Supreme Court in 2014 has said no. Any offense under the IPC can make out an unlawful object. Again, rule of interpretation.
Thank you, Nagmudh sir. We have Nawaz Jan with the hands up. Please, Nawaz Jan, you can put the question.
Yes.
Good evening, sir. First of all, thank you very much for the extremely beautifully described session on interpretation of statute. So my doubt is, at times when the administrative law is being interpreted, do we uphold the legislative intent? Now, for example, the appointment of employees for continuously for 189 days. Means if it crosses 180 days, he will be deemed to be a permanent employee. So on 189th day, that employee is kept outside, and after giving a gap of 1 day, again he is reinstated, and he will continue like that for a period of even 10 or 15 years. Now, just because of the interpretation that he has served continuously for a period of 189 days, he will be conferred the status of a
permanent.
Temporary employee only. Now, here, whether the intent of the legislature is served or not. My second question is with regard to the preventive detention laws. There also we say that at a time, the detention cannot exceed 90 days. And if it has to be exceeded beyond 90 days, the recommendation of the committee has to be taken into account. Even there, the committee relies on the material provided by the authorities only. There is no opportunity of being heard of that detainee. So here also, what is the exact legislative intent? Is it not that a person shall not be kept in custody for more than 90 days? Is it the legislative intent? Or the legislative intent is that he can be extended to be in the detention for any number of days? This is my doubt.
The legislature has actually this 180 days. We'll deal with each question. 180 days. That is 6 months. I think the Industrial Disputes Act provides for 240 days of continuous employment. If that be so, he can be terminated only by virtue of recourse to inquiry proceedings, only after domestic inquiry. This is the basis on which that 180 days people terminate a person or have a contract executed for 180 days is carried out. I think the legislative intent is not evident from anything. The legislative intent is clear that if a person continues in employment or continuously or remains in employment continuously for a period of 240 days, then he shall be terminated only by recourse to disciplinary proceedings, without which he shall not be terminated. So there is nothing which could indicate a contra intention from the part of the legislature. If there was a contra indication, then probably what you say is correct, that they shall not be terminated, even if it is after 180 days or even if it is less than 180 days. But the legislature, for reasons well known, best known to them, created this cutoff date of 240 days for bringing in a domestic inquiry for termination. That wisdom of the legislature is not something which we can question unless it is found by some court that is arbitrary or unreasonable. And if that provision is struck down, then what you said is correct. Otherwise, they have to create some date. It could be 1 day, 10 days, 20 days, 100 days, 150, they said 240. So merely because a provision is being misused by an employer, I wouldn't say misuse, is utilized by an employer to his advantage.
Misinterpreted by employer.
Utilized by an employer to his advantage.
Yes,
We will put it that way. That does not mean that the legislative intention is not understood. And as far as the other question is concerned, that also wouldn't the same principle apply?
Sir, I think it is more or less like saying that tax
Yes, yes.
evasion and tax management. End of the day, what you do may be strictly in the stricto sensu might be an offense, but if it's permitted or if you can manage your situation, I think there is absolutely nothing wrong in that.
No, when Article 22 says that if he is to be detained beyond 3 months, then the report of the advisory committee ought to be obtained. The mandatory requirement. That is where the advisory committee steps in. Otherwise, no advisory board should be there. Advisory board steps in only when if the detainee is to be detained beyond 3 months. It's a requirement of the statute.
No, those dates, the number of days, 3 months, 90 days, or 240 days, these are all statutory prescriptions or constitutional prescriptions, which nobody can question the wisdom of keeping. Why that figure, that date? Why do we have a default bail, statutory default bail of 90 days and 60 days?
60 days.
It could have been 30 days, it could have been 120 days.
In fact, 57 days, 24 hours.
24
Investigation should be completed in 24 hours.
24 hours.
Then it is extended by 15 days. Then extended by 15 days by 167. Then comes the proviso.
Then comes the...
Let us have the question that has been put up by Nagamuthu sir as well. Please, Prem, over to you.
Well, sir, I would say that it was a very engaging and insightful lecture and a very awesome command of the material. Even though it's a very vast subject, it was a clear, concise presentation with really a very perfect academic slant, I would say. And so, with regard to the contrast between section 133 and 114 of the Evidence Act, so the recent ruling which Justice Nagamuthu referred, that Somasundaram's case, the 3-judge bench, in paras 59 to 66, this has been discussed. And it would go on to say that there is absolutely no conflict actually between 133 and 114. Because the illustration is merely a rule of prudence which is laid in section 114. And 113 authorization to the court to convict the accused on a corroborated testimony of an accomplice. So says this is a 3-judge decision actually.
Para 59 to?
Para 59 to 66.
Oh, that's interesting. This particular thing is referred to in that.
It has been referred to that and even the latest ruling of that Hashim versus State of Tamil Nadu. There the words ordinarily, that also was culled out and it was applied. It was said, of course, even without direct evidence, circumstantial evidence also could be looked into, so that that also could aid as a matter of, as a means of corroboration. And so I just have one doubt, sir. While giving the lecture, he went on to state a recent ruling of His Lordship Justice Deepak Gupta, saying that a court can add a word or subtract a word in a statute if there is, if the legislature is not clear enough.
Intention of the legislature.
Is it could you just tell me what's the strength of that bench, sir?
I think 2.
But sir, there was a 2-judge
Aniruddha Bose and Justice Deepak Gupta.
Okay, actually there was a 2-judge bench in Rohitash Kumar's case, that is AR 2013 Supreme Court page 30, wherein it was stated that the court cannot, for any reasons, whatever be the reason, the court can never add or subtract anything from a statute. And this particular judgment that was subsequently reiterated by a constitution-based decision in Hardeep Singh's case, 2000 AR 2014 Supreme Court 1400.
14.
2014. That is by Lord Chief Justice Chauhan.
No, I think by
No, Chauhan. Yeah, Justice
he
Chauhan.
may be a member of the bench.
No, authored by Honorable Justice Chauhan only. That earlier Dharampal was authored by Justice Altamas Kabir, and earlier constitution.
Dharampal. Yes, I am sorry.
Dharampal was
Correct,
authored by Justice
You are right.
Kabir. This is by Justice Chauhan only. Yes.
Chauhan.
Yes. Please go ahead, Mr. Prem.
So it was a very engaging talk, very excellent lecture you have delivered.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
So, Prem, what is that citation? That Constitution bench?
One is AR 2013 Supreme Court, page 30. That is Rohitash Kumar's case, where the court went on to, that's a two-judge decision, where the court said a section has to be interpreted by reading its part together, and it is not permissible either to add or omit any part thereof. And the court has to go along with the presumption that the legislature, even if the legislature has committed some mistake in enacting the statute, it must proceed on the footing that that is what the legislature intended, even if there are some defects in the phraseology. And this was applied in Hardeep Singh's case, AR 2014 Supreme Court, page 1400.
Now, Mr. Prem, take for instance, I am found to be in physical possession of ganja in the dicky of my car. Technically I can be convicted.
Right.
Courts have evolved the principle conscious possession. Section only says possession. Any person found in possession of ganja, of a narcotic drug, can be convicted, can be found guilty. But courts have evolved a principle conscious possession. Without my conscious knowledge, I can be in possession, in physical possession of ganja. But I am not aware of that. That is where the courts have stepped in.
Particular terminology becomes in Avtar Singh's case, that a particular person was seen sitting on a sack of ganja, and when he was caught, I think the conscious possession that evolved in the Avtar Singh's case first. Of course, but when interpreting a statute,
there may be situations for wherein courts may have to act to give effect to the legislative intent.
True.
Did not.
No, the principle of
May have
casus.
to add words.
Casus omissus.
Yes, casus omissus.
Also some
Oh, there is no complete bar, but you cannot add any word contrary to the intention of the legislature. If the omission is
Exactly.
unconscious, then you can read a particular word into the section. That is one of the tools of interpretation. But at the same time, you cannot add some word into a provision, read the same into it, so as to defeat the legislative intention. So the benchmark is the legislative intention only. That is what my understanding.
Yes,
That is-
just what Justice Nagamuthu sir said is correct. Even in that, I was just going through that decision, even in that Hardeep Singh's case, court shall not add any word to make or delete any word or omit any word so as to make the legislation ineffective or purposeless.
Yes.
The attempt is to make the whole legislation workable by finding out the intents of the legislation. In that process, one shall not you make a word as a surplusage, construe a word as a surplusage or ineffective or purposeless. But
recast. Court cannot
or
recast.
make a provision into a dead letter, or they refer to the term as useless lumber. That is the terminology used in that decision.
Yes, yes.
Useless lumber. But then, when the statutory provision does not make any sense, or it leads to an incongruous result or an
Absurdity. Or even
absurdity, then court can construe it.
But sir, just see that para 42 of the judgment.
I saw
Para
that.
42 goes on to say about that Rohitash Singh's case of 2013.
I saw that. 2013 Supreme Court 30.
Correct, sir.
So we have Gaumati R with rather a question or a statement. Gaumati, are you there?
Yeah. Hello, sir. Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm in travel. Just I don't want to disturb the entire session, so posted there. Luckily, I got the network back. Lordship, very happy to see you. It was just an enlightened session, and you're very much blessed to hear all these interpretation of statutes. It's an ocean, as you said. It's an ocean, as you said, but you're covered. Gave us an essence, Lordship. And my question was posted there in the chat box. The role of the judiciary is to interpret laws. When can the judges make laws? And what is the validity of those acts? For example, Lordship Nagamuthu Ayya is here. And morning also, he was there in the session. I'm very happy to see him also. Okay, Lordship. Here, the Prevention of Atrocity of SC/ST Act. There was a legislation and which said that a bail, there can't be anticipatory bails, non-bailable offense, everything was there in the act. But there was a Supreme Court judgment which said that pre-investigation techniques should be made and it can be made a bailable offense, anticipatory bail can be granted with the this one of the DSP. Everything was there in the act. The Supreme Court has interpreted the act, and I could say that it has constructed also. So, to what extent the judges can make laws, bending the interpretation, bending the statutes? Can they make a law? Is it valid? And just tell me, Lordship.
What about Vishaka? What about Vishaka?
Yes, Lordship.
He made law.
Yes, Lordship.
What we judicial legislation? Okay.
So how can we take that? That is the question. How can we take that? It's a tricky question, but yes, Lordship.
May I answer, sir?
Yes, Lordship.
Definitely.
Yes, Lordship.
One part of it, it's a very valid question. This is a point which actually engages our mind quite often.
Yes,
but
Lordship.
one thing that crossed my mind is judges certainly cannot make law. But Supreme Court, the supreme law of the land is a constitution. The constitution says law declared by the Supreme Court under Article 141. What the Supreme Court declares shall be the law. So there is, though it is not a stricto sensu, it is not a law, it has been given all the trappings of a law by the Constitution, by the constitutional provision itself. So in reference to that, I can say that certain times, like in Vishaka's case, what the Supreme Court declared became the law.
Smoking, Kerala High Court. Smoking in public places.
In fact, that decision, the word pollutant was directly contradictory to the Environmental Protection Act.
Justice V.R. Krishnaiyar has said once that when the legislature has failed to legislate in a particular area in which they would have legislated, then judicial arm should extend to that area. That is his Lordship's wordings. Maybe Vishaka's case is an outcome of such observations.
There are several decisions like that, like Vishaka.
First thing was Srikant Pandey's case, adoption of minor children.
Yes, adoption.
Then even the collegium system.
And
See, that's
doctrine of public trust. Public trust, MC Mehta.
No, but
living will and advance directives, etc.
Exactly.
we put a,
Union Carbide case we have.
the collegium system is not actually a lawmaking, but it is actually an interpretation.
It's an interpretation.
What was done by them was not actually, unlike Vishaka's case or the living will. What they did was the collegium system. What they did was they interpreted the concept and created a separate mechanism by a process of interpretation.
No, actually, what happened was they had devised a specific procedure for the appointment, a specific procedure for appointment and transfer of High Court judges.
No, they said they said consultation means concurrence. The word consultation was defined as meaning concurrence. And
yes,
they also said,
right, whenever there is void, the Supreme Court under Article 142, they are free to step in. Even now, see the Ritesh Sinha's case, 2019, which we we see the voice
That
samples
is,
being.
that is to do complete justice. That is to complete
Complete
justice in a particular case.
In a particular case, if the field is in vacuum, then they can fill in the gaps till a suitable legislation comes into place. Then Vineet Narayan, we have that CBI matter regarding the investigations and CBC functionings.
98 Supreme Court.
1998.
Now the recent addition is a divorce on the ground that the marriage is irretrievably broken.
But that cannot be done.
Yeah. So many orders of divorce are granted.
Irretrievable breakdown of marriage.
Yes.
That was under a reference actually.
Under 142 it is done.
42 or 141?
It is under 142. They exercise the power under 142 and grant divorce on the ground that the marriage is irretrievably broken. I raised one issue before the Honorable Supreme Court. Can any such order granting divorce can act as a precedent?
Precedent.
Can it act as a precedent?
142. If it is 142, it cannot.
Cannot be a precedent.
No,
But
no, under 142 they can do complete justice between
Complete
the
justice
parties
between the parties in a pending action.
No, they also declare that this is the law. There are very many judgments where they say under 142 they declare the same as a law to be applicable to all cases.
No,
They make a declaration.
sir, sir, subject to correction.
Yes,
Under
please.
142, I think what they can do, what the Supreme Court can do, is to render justice to the parties to that particular litigation. And then when
What
they
about
make
limitation?
when they make a
What about
declaration,
limitation?
when they make a declaration, they make a declaration under section 141.
What
fact-
about extension of limitation?
This COVID, the present pandemic situation,
That is done under 142.
that was under 141.
No, not under 142.
No, 142 also. They made it clear.
They have done it under 142 only.
That is in fact under Sumoto writ petition numbers 3 of 2020.
Be under 141.
3 2020.
No,
and
both.
1 of 6.
They-
It is 142
they-
we invoke our power under 142, read with 141.
They do it on 142.
And so even under 142, you cannot step outside the substantive law. Substantive law can never be
This paragraph reads, we are exercising this read with
Plenary powers of the apex court. They can do anything.
In one of the judgments delivered in 2019 by Honorable Justice M.R. Shah, he has reported a lot of judgments where the Supreme Court has granted divorce on the ground that the marriage is irretrievably broken. And treating all those judgments as precedents, now the Supreme Court says in this case also, therefore we are giving. No, I raised an issue that you cannot treat the same as a precedent, therefore the matter is pending now.
Applicable only to the parties.
Yes.
Sir, we have Kali Darun with a question. Kali, can you just step forward and unmute yourself and put the question?
Good evening, sir. Good evening, sir. Hello. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Good evening.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, sir. Sir, just very nice lecture, sir. Just one small question, sir. I am just a second year student from Shastra University. So my question is, you made a distinction between legislation by reference and legislation by incorporation. And later on, you said that the court made an interpretation wherein they said that legislation by incorporation is almost the same as legislation by reference. So, is there any other distinction between these two concepts, sir, or
No, there is a major difference. The major difference is that if it is a legislation by reference, automatically, without anything, every amendment that takes place in the referred legislation will automatically become part of the subsequent legislation. Subsequent legislation. In the legislation by incorporation, only those amendments till the date of that incorporation will become part of it. Otherwise, as per the present position, only if the 4 conditions mentioned in that IPC's case, section 21 of the Indian Penal Code, in the 4 conditions mentioned in those cases, if those 4 conditions are satisfied alone, would the subsequent amendments will become part of the subsequent statute. Otherwise, the main distinction is that legislation by incorporation, no amendments have any effect. Even if the incorporated statute undergoes a repeal
Yes.
amendment, nothing will affect. It will continue to be there in that subsequent enactment. If in the legislation by reference, a statute is referred to and that statute undergoes a change, all changes will be part of that referred statute. If a legislation is repealed, that legislation
reenacted.
reenacted
statute.
the reenacted statute will apply. This is based on Section 8 of the General Clauses Act.
Deepak, you want to add?
Yeah, actually, it's not a question. It's a very interesting discussion about the intellectual level. But in practical sense, what is happening? While we are practicing Supreme Court, we can understand what is happening. In Ayodhya judgment, in which category we can say this 141 or 142 or some other provision? What is the judgment there?
142. 142.
Sir, we have to examine that properly, sir. How? So it's a very, very interesting judgment, but it's an intellectual, it's very, very excellent. But
Deepak, always throw open questions. We'll throw open issues for discussion. Thank you for that. We have Harish Vasudevan making a good statement. Harish, are you there?
Sir, no, I just want to add one with regards to the definition of Forest Conservation Act.
I was about to ask you
very purpose
refer to the forest definition.
very purpose of Forest Conservation Act was to protect forest without having a definition of forest. That was incorporated by Supreme Court.
True.
Thank you, Harish.
If
That was
such
incorporated
kind
in
of a
the
lapse is there.
So that was incorporated in the Godavarman Thirumalpad case.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Continuing mandamus.
But those are all interlocutory orders. Interlocutory orders now being referred to as final orders or precedents.
Yes.
Harish, how can we say that even the wording given, the definition of the word forest given in an interlocutory order will have a binding effect all over the country unless there is a declaration by the Supreme Court saying that it is a law under section, we declare this to be a law under section 141.
141.
Exactly. If somebody files an application for amendment of that particular order, what will the Supreme Court do is very curious to think.
And you will have to undo all the decisions that has been rendered basing on that.
Exactly. That is not forced. That's done.
Correct.
Excellent class, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Otherwise,
we conclude. We have as Dilip with the state. Dilip, are you there? Dilip. Sharath, you made a statement. Sharath is from Hyderabad, I believe. Yeah, Sharath, please.
Well, it was just a small this thing because we were discussing about whether the courts have power to make laws. I just came across this judgment. It says normally it is said that the duty of the court is only to interpret the law as it is, but not make laws.
Make laws.
That's just what I in fact. Yes. That subject it has been clarified. Therefore, I did not specifically come.
Thank you, Sharath. I think Dilip is back. Dilip, please.
Yeah.
Unmute. Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. I am just referring to the concept of conscious possession mentioned by Justice Ramkumar, sir. Is it not only a reaffirmation of the requirement of proof of mens rea before conviction?
Ramkumar, sir, I think the gun is pointed at you.
Is it something? It's not. I don't think it's a sort of interpretation. But
see, maybe we can think that how when we say the word possession, what constitutes possession? A person is there and if something is placed near him. In Ali Mustafa's case, Kollam railway station, that was also held there. If that is there, and can he say that? Can one say that he is in conscious possession or he is in possession? If he is unaware of something, which comes to his, see, that possession in the literal sense. Possession. Can you say that he
Possession
possessing
requires
that
two
thing?
elements. Possession
Right.
requires two elements.
See,
Corpus of
there is a
possession and
So
animus
I think
possession.
this interpretation started from, I think, Dangerous Drugs Act. Dangerous Drugs Act also there, the expression possession. There also Supreme Court said dangerous possession means it can only be conscious possession, not mere possession. Possession can be even conscious or unconscious possession. Only conscious possession will constitute the offense. Or attract the offense.
Ramkumar sir, that
Legal
I
possession.
believe appears to be, I believe, why do we say something that is, it's not a concept of interpretation, but is it not reading into it that a mental element or a mens rea ought to be there for that offense?
That is exactly
That is so. That is so. That is so. But then, right from Dangerous Drugs, I think it is Dangerous Drugs Act also. Way back in 1967 or so, Supreme Court interpreted the word possession to be conscious possession. Otherwise, the offense is not attracted. A person can be in unconscious possession also. Of course, mens rea was being read into the expression.
But
Actually, what I think what Dilip wants to say is against Section 35 of the NDPS Act, right?
Yes, yes.
It's a culpable mental
Culpable mental state. Culpable mental state.
Correct.
Court can presume.
Proceed.
Dilip,
yes.
You get a similar provision in other statutes also. Did not in
Yes.
POCSO also, I think there is a
In civil law, the possession, conscious possession, legal possession, it should be, there should be a corpus as well as the animus to possess.
Animus possidendi and the
Animus
corpus
possidendi and corpus possessionis. Only then a possession can be attributed.
See, I recollect a judgment by Honorable Mr. Justice K.T. Thomas on the word occupation. Cessation of occupation in the building, Kerala Buildings.
Rent Control Act.
Right.
Non-user. Non-user.
Right. There also, the occupation, there must be
An
something
intention.
to prove that he is an actual occupation. And see, mere the word mere occupation is
of no consequence, but there
Mere non-user is not enough.
right. Not enough. Not enough.
That's a wonderful example, sir. So,
Thank you, sir.
This is Bachukurin Thomas, sir. I believe you would have enjoyed being with us as much as we enjoyed being with you today.
I enjoyed very much.
The journey continues, and today we are on the 51st session. We completed half century yesterday, like I mentioned earlier, but the journey continues. We are deeply indebted to Justice Ramkumar sir and Kamal Pasha sir for their, and Nagamuthu sir especially, of course, putting up that question which is yet to be answered, which we'll definitely deliberate and we'll come back to that, for their valuable presence and inputs, and all of you for being here today. And tomorrow in the 52nd session, we have Justice B.N. Sri Krishna sir. He'll be dealing with the topic data protection.